Welcome to Villanova University, the Center for Church Management, and to the second in our three-part webinar series on new research on giving, debt, and funding in the church. My name is Matt Davis, and I'm the new Associate Director in the Center for Church Management. It's my joy and pleasure to welcome you today. To honor our Augustinian Catholic tradition here at Villanova, and the topic of our presentation today, which is about seminaries and seminarians, I invite you to pray quietly with me this prayer for vocations. Let us pray to the Lord of the harvest, who calls men and women to loving service. All glory and praise are yours, God of truth, light of our hearts, for you guide your people in the way of holiness. Help us be inspired by the life of St. Augustine, to seek you through mutual love and worship, and to be servants of your church as examples that others may follow. Enlighten men and women to see the beauty of common life in the spirit of St. Augustine, and strengthen them in your service so that the work you have begun in them may be brought to fulfillment. We ask this through our Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So the mission in the Center for Church Management is to provide education and scholarship in the Augustinian Catholic tradition on strategic, management, and financial matters in service to leaders of churches and other Christian faith-based communities. Here in the center, we try to take the best of the business and management world and adapt it and integrate it. We say baptize it at the services of churches and faith-based ministries, so they can better serve their mission to live and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. At the Center for Church Management, we have three main branches. The first one is our Master of Science in Church Management. It's a 30-credit degree program from the Villanova School of Business. It's a 2-year online program, both live and asynchronous learning. I'm a 2021 grad of the program and could not say enough good things about it. We also have 3 non-credit certificate programs. The first one is, again, a church management one. It basically takes the master's degree program and takes a semester-long class and boils it down to one 1.5-hour lecture. So these would be 12 1.5-hour lectures over 9 months. We also have a church management fermented formation certificate program. This is in person on campus at Villanova. It's for seminarians and it's for priests in their last who have not yet been ordained 5 years. The third thing we have is a Catholic school management certificate. This is for administrators, principals, vice principal, rising leaders, everything you need to know about management and finances that you maybe didn't learn and suddenly become a teacher. These are 12 asynchronous sessions over 12 months, so it's 1 session per month that you do. Our last branch is research and scholarship. We have center-led scholarship led by Center for Church Management faculty and other Villanova faculty. And then we have other research that's done by academics and researchers from other institutions. And today we have an example of that. Our agenda for today, we're going to introduce briefly our presenter, Kristina. She'll do her presentation, and then we'll do a question and answer at the end. All questions will be taken by the chat box and through the chat box. So anytime during the presentation, if you have a question, feel free to put into the chat box, and then I'll gather those up at the end and share them with Kristina. A reminder to keep yourself on mute. And our goal is to wrap up today after 1 hour, about 3 p.m. Eastern time. I now want to welcome and introduce Matthew Mannion. He's the David Grennan Family Faculty Director of Villanova's Center for Church Management and Master of Science in Church Management degree program. He's also a professor of practice in the Management and Operations Department of the Villanova University School of Business. It's my pleasure to welcome Matthew Mannion.
Thanks, Matt Davis, and it's great to see so many familiar faces on here, and thrilled to be with you again, as this is the second of these 3 series of research presentations that we're doing, and we try and do these periodically throughout the year to make available the wonderful research that's coming out of the center and that's being sponsored by the center in service to people like all of you and the practitioners who can make this research come to life. So yeah, it's my privilege to introduce officially for you. So for those who were with us last week, we'll just repeat it, but for those who are not, as kind of a reminder, the Center for Church Management received a very generous gift from the Lilly Endowment as part of their national initiative to address economic challenges facing pastoral leaders. And as part of that grant, both the late Dr. John Wimmer from Lilly Endowment and Chuck Zeck, the esteemed founder of the Center for Church Management, our retired professor emeritus of economics here at Villanova, the two of them had the vision of investing in continuing to develop church management as a field of study, as an academic field of study, and in cultivating emerging scholars and kind of early to mid-career scholars who would turn a bit of their scholarly attention to issues facing the church. And so we're really thrilled to have Kristina here, who's an exemplar on that. And so she was awarded a fellowship back in 2019 with one of these research fellowships and did some really fascinating work on clergy attitudes towards credit and debt, which I think you'll mention, Kristina, where it's been published, but published in a nice, great journal, as well as made available to other clergy and folks who want to assist them. And then, this past year, completed research for us again, as you're going to see, on kind of how seminaries handle educational debt for seminarians, how dioceses handle that. And so Kristina, as you can see from our title right there, works for the American Society of Clinical Oncology as a program manager in the Department of Education, Science, and Professional Development. Prior to that, she worked for several years at Our Lady of the Lake University and Seminary in San Antonio, Texas, including serving as an associate professor of economics and chair of the Department of Business there. And she won the Moody Professor Award for her contribution as a faculty member in the research scholarship area. She's also taught in various other undergrad and MBA programs and has really had a focus on the economics of religion. And she's also quite the world traveler. And so Kristina's got the wonderful international background, having been born in Brussels, Belgium, lived in England and Germany. And as I was reading her CV, she's got, I don't know, call it fluency, but is able to get around and converse with people from whether they're speaking German or Russian or Ukrainian or French or even Serbo-Croatian and Italian. So I'm hoping you're going to present for us today in English, Kristina, since that's the bulk of our listeners for this afternoon. But yeah, really excited. So Matt, if you can stop sharing, we'll give Kristina the sharing privileges and she can take over the screen and give us some wonderful research on, how kind of educational debt is handled in various seminaries and various dioceses throughout the United States. And so we love the title here, Kristina, All May Not Be Forgiven. Post-seminary financial liabilities for diocesan Catholics pursuing ordination. So Kristina, thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing your research.
And thank you so much, Matt, for your very kind and flattering introduction. I really appreciate it. Certainly, it's my pleasure to join you all today to continue to work with the wonderful folks of Villanova and the Center for Church Management, and really to have this opportunity to share my research on seminarian debt, particularly with this group representing several dioceses. And so I figure I'll start with what inspired me to pursue this topic. As Matt Mannion mentioned, I was fortunate to receive an earlier fellowship with the Center for Church Management, wherein I examined clergy attitudes toward credit and debt. And my goal at the time was to identify how efficacious clergy are in their handling of credit and debt. And this was done pre-pandemic. And frankly, it's research that I would love to continue because I'm sure a lot of things, have changed or people have been affected, of course, because of the pandemic in their financial situations. So what I did at that time was I conducted in-depth interviews with Baptist, Lutheran, and Roman Catholic, both diocesan and religious clergy. I identified through an oral history what are their meanings or understanding of credit and debt, their uses and practices, interactions with credit and debt throughout their lifetime, and how essentially that impacted them as consumers. And then what I did was I categorized them along a spectrum where at one end, basically, the idea was that these are the people who are essentially just managing debt and could use a little help, are facing some issues, and here are the areas that we could explore further with them. Versus at the other end of the spectrum, these are the people that are, quote, doing the right thing, which means that basically they are following the recommendations of, what a financial advisor might tell you to do. So while conducting these interviews, I also spoke with some MDiv students at the time in a Catholic seminary. And we had some very interesting conversations beyond the formal interview. So there was one student in particular who I believe at the time brought along a peer, who kind of just joined us, sat in and listened to the interview. And then after the fact, they started talking to me about, debt that they expect that they might have following ordination. And that wasn't even really part of this per se. But I kind of probed a little bit further, and they volunteered a lot of interesting information about what might be their liabilities. And they were both from dioceses from across the nation. So two very different dioceses. And one of them had mentioned that he's expecting to have to pay back some debts, various debts, through given his priestly salary post ordination. And then there was also mention of, well, but if we left early, if we were to withdraw or to discern out, we would actually be liable for such and such. And that involved even some talk of health insurance coverage that might have to be paid back. And I was like, this is really fascinating, because I didn't think that they would be liable for anything, following seminary. I thought, they're ordained and they're able to move on and, serve their parish and their community, and they wouldn't have to worry so much about any kind of financial obligation at that point. So, some of the questions that came to mind were, what happens vis-a-vis their diocese in particular. And as far as my previous work is concerned, the clergy attitudes toward credit and debt, that is published in the Journal of Applied Business and Economics, and the citation is, or the reference rather, is there in the slide if you'd like to look into that further. And feel free also to reach out to me. I'll leave my contact information on the very last slide when we get to the end of the presentation. As far as the purpose of this current study, the main question that I'm exploring is, what are the financial liabilities then post-seminary for diocesan Catholics pursuing priestly ordination with respect to their diocese? And then more specifically, this is at the theologate level. So I break this down into 3 scenarios. And they are, what happens if someone withdraws voluntarily from the theologate? In other words, if they discern out. What happens if instead they're asked to leave? And then finally, if they are able to complete seminary and are ordained and then subsequently leave the priesthood, what kind of liabilities might they have, if any, at that point in time? So what I do is I pursue basically a comparative study looking at policies across different dioceses. As far as the relevant literature to date, most of the work has been done on pre-existing educational debt as a barrier to entry. And I would say what I do in this study is I look more so as debt as an exit barrier. And so if we look at what Gautier and Cidade did in 2012, they focused on the impact of debt on entry into Catholic religious life and the financial strain imposed on religious institutes. They learned about the various policies and practices on how those institutes handle educational debt, given their experiences with various inquirers and candidates. And another finding was that there were 70% of institutes that had written policies or practices in place on handling debt. And separate from that, it's worth noting that some inquirers were being told to hold off from applying or even turned away altogether because of pre-existing debt. Another relevant study to the work that I've been doing is from Ruger about 30 years ago. This is probably most closely associated with what I'm doing here with looking at liabilities at the theologate level. And Ruger examined whether students were going into debt at that time and collected data primarily from financial aid officers at seminaries, as well as from graduates and some Catholic institutes or institutions rather. And he found that the typical Roman Catholic theological student graduate or theological school graduate has no formal educational debt for a theological school. He did admit that he had limited data on Roman Catholics because he was told by many financial aid officers who were supplying data that most of those financial matters were typically overseen by the diocese. He also noted that some dioceses assume undergraduate debt, but most say that it's the student's responsibility both before and after ordination, as well as most dioceses cover theological school tuition in full, but half require repayment if not ordained. So there were a couple of additional papers that followed up with Ruger, Miller, and Early, and they noted that there were students who were carrying a small proportion of debt to majority of students, carrying debt over time and larger amounts of debt, and that probably is not surprising to anyone. They did focus primarily on educational loans, Stafford loans, and the effect on individuals' personal and professional life and their persistence in ministry. And lastly, the Miller-Early-Ruger paper looked at issues in helping students manage debt and how to overcome those debts and what schools can do to help in terms of grants and financial planning. So all of those are in some way, again, related to and helped me kind of narrow my focus to what I wanted to do in terms of the research for this particular study on seminary and debt. With regard to my research methods, what I did was I reached out to vocation directors at dioceses that sponsor theologates. So that narrowed the list of dioceses in the United States down to 35 theologates as per the Center of Applied Research and Apostolate at Georgetown, their Catholic Ministry Formation Directory. My survey consisted of 15 questions, mostly open-ended, regarding financial policies, also involving other forms of financial assistance like loans and grants, and I'll get into that. And I did make use of SurveyMonkey for this. My response rate was, I guess you could say, anywhere from 60 to 69%, depending if we're talking about purely dioceses, then 60%. But of the 35 dioceses solicited, for this study, I had 24 respondents. So there was overlap with 3 dioceses where I received more than one response. And these dioceses were located in or across 14 different states. What kind of data did I gather on the respondents from the surveys? So as far as those who actually submitted responses, they were primarily directors or associate directors of vocations or directors of seminarians, 83%, and then the remainder were vocations office staff. Across the diocese, seminarians were sent to 39 different theologates. And in the pie chart there, you should be able to see the top 5. So the most popular was the Pontifical North American College in Rome, followed by a tie between Pope St. John the 23rd and Mount St. Mary's in Ohio. And then lastly, an equivalent number of dioceses were sending their candidates to Mount St. Mary's in Maryland and St. Vincent de Paul in Florida. So the first question that I asked in my survey to get a baseline was, does your diocese accept men to theologate with outstanding educational debt? And so we're talking about undergraduate debt here. And an overwhelming number, 90% actually, of the dioceses do accept men with outstanding educational debt, accepting them to theologate. Less than half, however, assume some responsibility for the debt. And there are some non-responses in there, and I try to indicate that as best I can going through. Regarding the outstanding educational debt, how would the diocese handle this debt? So those that do assume some debt might provide partial assistance, and mostly post-ordination, or they might have certain coverage limits. So for instance, we might accept you to theologate if you have only $30,000 worth of debt. Or we might, cover a maximum of 50,000, and then you're responsible for anything in excess of that. Or there may be an 80-20 split, or solely interest might be covered by the diocese on a case-by-case basis. So the numbers that you see reflected there in the parentheses, that refers to the number of dioceses that may have responded, in that way. And then as far as making payments over several years, that might occur after ordination, and That would be the diocese that's making those payments. The diocese, two of them also recommended exploring options to eliminate college debt by partnering with, an organization such as the Liabilities Society. You may be familiar, it's a nonprofit Catholic organization that helps with minimization and hopefully altogether elimination of educational debt. And then the dioceses that do not assume debt, their expectations were as follows. So this was, a greater number of dioceses that did not assume debt versus those that did assume some of the debt of the seminarians after a theologate. So there were 4 who recommended, or required rather, I should say, that seminarians pay off or reduce their debt before entering or applying. So maybe reduce debt to, $30,000 was mentioned, or $40,000, something that would be, quote, reasonable to cover, after ordination based on a priest's salary, which I believe, according to a 2022 survey, was around 33,000. But if you add in, other assistance that's provided and housing and those sorts of things, then it gets up to 49,000 roughly, just to put things into context. Also, the diocese, there were 4 who said that they would ask the seminarians to defer their payments if possible, or pay them over time. And they might help them near the end of seminary to make those payments, or after ordination. And then again, there's this encouragement to work with the Liabilities Society to reduce debt. And then there was one diocese that simply said, well, we would connect the seminarian with the bishop, and they would have a chat, and we would go from there and see what happens. So as far as covered expenses, what do dioceses cover at the theologate level? So all of the respondents said that they cover the most significant expenses, which are tuition and room and board. Most also said that they covered the related fees. Over half did cover additional expenses and provide other allowance, for example, for entertainment and travel. Now, quick note here, when it comes to the additional living expenses or other categories, certainly those are open to interpretation on the part of the respondent. And in hindsight, it would have been nice to follow up with a question and ask the vocation directors further, to elaborate on, some of these additional living expenses so that they could provide possibly more specific examples. In terms of offers of financial assistance, 1/3 of the diocese offered loans or grants. Technically, when you break it down further, 3 of them offered loans, 2 offered grants. There was one that offered both loans and grants, but it was more common for the diocese within my sample to offer other forms of financial assistance. So these other forms were, for example, stipends for living expenses, which ranged anywhere from $200 per month to $1,500 per semester, and or stipends for books, which ranged anywhere from $300 to $1,000, but it was not indicated over what period of time that would be granted. And then health insurance coverage, there was one diocese in particular that specifically highlighted that they do provide health insurance, full coverage for their seminarians 26 years of age and older. When it comes to scholarships, primarily, I would say seminarians were actually redirected to external scholarships, not scholarships necessarily coming directly from the diocese. There was mention of paid house jobs on campus, also paying a monthly student loan and assisting with that if someone was unable to defer their payments. And then dioceses did connect seminarians with external grants and other organizations. And again, you see the Liabilities Society coming up here once again. What were the terms of the various forms of financial assistance when we break down further and look at the loans and the grants? So when it comes to the loans, partial student loan help might be possible. with the caveat that partial repayment of tuition for seminary would be necessary if a seminarian did not complete his current year of study. One diocese did mention a prior promissory note, including interest, but unfortunately that vocation director did not have more specific information as to what the terms would be, excuse me. And then there were loans to help with the purchase of a car or to pay off a high interest loan on past educational expenses, as well as interest-free loans for minor seminarians who eventually become theologians to be repaid, however, if they leave seminary. When it comes to grants, the terms were a little bit more explicit, I think. There were grants for car repairs or uninsured medical expenses, and no repayment was necessary as long as the first $100 was covered in these cases. There were several endowed grants totaling up to $4,000 per man, not asked to be repaid, of course, in the case of one diocese. And then there were conditions for a grant that the individual apply for loans being offered from organizations like the Knights of Columbus or Hibernians, etc. And the reason that you see across loans and grants, some of those highlighted in purple is because that refers to the one diocese that offered both loans and grants. So we finally get to what are the liabilities under the three different scenarios. The first being, what if one withdraws voluntarily or discerns out? And you see highlighted in blue there the actual question that was asked of the vocation directors. And in terms of the responses, 3/4 had no expectation of repayment. And then 15% required partial repayment in different manners of tuition, if possible, was, what they indicated verbatim, or half of the expenses incurred during their time as a seminarian, or possibly $2,500 per academic year if they were to leave formation. And then 15%, I thought this was worth noting because you'll see that this comes up consistently. 15% of the diocese did highlight that seminarians are responsible for outstanding educational debt, in other words, undergraduate debt that they have entered into theologate with. And you see the breakdown there with the pie chart. I don't know if Matt, we're taking any questions if anyone happens to have any questions, or we're just waiting until the end. So I want to make sure I haven't lost anyone.
No, we're going to save them for the end for you, Kristina.
Okay.
But if anybody wants to, you can feel free to post them in the chat room and make sure we get them once she finishes.
Okay, sounds great.
Thanks for checking.
Sure. So what happens if they're dismissed, if the rector asks someone to leave theologate? So here we actually have a very similar response to the previous scenario, in that in total, 75% of the diocese had no expectation of repayment. Now, the reason you see 65% there is because the additional 10% said that they themselves, the diocese, would pay the remaining balance for the semester or the year. And I just wanted to make sure to break that out to highlight that. But otherwise, in total, 75% had no expectation of the seminarian repaying anything. And then 15% require partial repayment, as in the previous case. So that means, the part of tuition or half of expenses, or the $2,500 per academic year. And then what happens if someone is ordained and eventually leaves the priesthood? What are their obligations, financially speaking? So from greatest to least number of dioceses, the tallest bar that you see in the chart there refers to no debt for theological formation. So I'm sorry for the typo there. That should say no debt for theological formation. And that's 7 of the dioceses. And then we could potentially add to that the columns, the 2 purple columns to the right, where it says that the diocese forgives all debt besides personal debt, or the archdiocese or diocese covers debts. The reason I broke those out is because when it comes to the way respondents answered the questions, it seemed to me as though they were considering possibly all prior educational debt and not just debt at the theologate level, whereas I tried to make it clear throughout the survey that we are at the beginning in the instructions and then all the way throughout that we're looking at debt at the, accrued at the theologate level. So if they were focusing on all outstanding educational debt, as far as those two little purple columns, then that would be inclusive of any debt possibly incurred at the theologate level, I would say, and then we could kind of add them to that big column there, and that would bring us up to 9 dioceses. There were set conditions for when a priest might be liable for certain expenses or for, the debts that they had incurred. And this was the case with 2 dioceses, that if any of the students had, or seminarians had, student debt greater than $50,000, they would have to pay anything beyond that, because that is the amount that would be paid immediately upon ordination. And that diocese was willing to accept candidates to the theologate who had more than $50,000, but made it clear that they would only pay $50,000 and that would occur immediately upon ordination. And then there was another instance where seminarians would be liable for their debt if they were to leave the priesthood before completing 5 years of ministry. And then the column that's broken out all by itself on the right-hand side, the pink column, says priest repays prior educational debt. So again, like I said, that is something that I've brought up a few times already, and that has consistently been volunteered. I wasn't even asking about that so much, except in my very first question on the survey. And they kept, wanting to highlight that, hey, anything that they came in with to theologate, though, they're going to be liable for that regardless. All right, so we're getting to the conclusions here. So in terms of my key findings, the primary finding I would say is that there appeared to be a pretty consistent approach across dioceses when it came to their expectations regarding debt. The vast majority of dioceses, remember that was 90%, accept men with pre-existing educational debt to the theologate. And there might be different ways in which they handle that debt. And I've summarized them here. So they might require total elimination of debt before entering, or they might establish a limit on what would be, quote, an acceptable amount of debt. So typically that was around $30,000 or $40,000. If you have no more than that, then we'll accept you to the theologate. Or they might restrict the amount of debt that the diocese would eventually cover. And that was the case of, $50,000. And if you have anything in excess of that, that is your sole responsibility. Or they might enter into a custom arrangement. So there was a case where there was an 80-20 split where the diocese would cover 80% of the debt of the seminarian, and the remainder would have to be covered by that individual. Additional findings. The diocese, all of them covered major expenses, tuition, room and board, as I mentioned. And several of them literally said, therefore, there is no debt from theologate that we can speak of for our seminarians. Financial assistance, recall that there were few loans or grants provided by the diocese, and that they actually preferred other forms of financial assistance, most popular being the stipends. And then regardless, a seminarian, again, I've said it, several times already, is primarily responsible for their outstanding educational debt. And I found it very interesting that this was similarly the case 30 years ago when Ruger did his study. So just as a quick reminder here, Ruger, when he was looking at whether students were going into debt at the level of the theologate, he said that some dioceses assume undergraduate debt, but most said it was the student's responsibility. Most dioceses cover theological school tuition in full, but around half require repayment if not ordained. So those were his findings. And then my study has shown that 3/4 of the dioceses in my group of respondents have no expectation of repayment, even if seminarian were to withdraw or to be asked to leave. And 15% of the diocese expect partial repayment. But keep in mind, there were some non-responses there. So I think it's interesting that in my group, there were 15% that expect partial repayment, whereas for Ruger, he said around half require repayment if someone is not ordained. So that makes me wonder, are the dioceses perhaps becoming a little bit more lenient in that regard over time? And there is that lingering question about, well, what about those who did not choose to respond to those particular questions? Well, if you factor them in, that would bring us up to 25%, and that's still not, half of the group that's Ruger, sent his questionnaire to and found that payment was required. Now, what are the financial implications? What would be best for the diocese? What might be best for the seminarian? Is there any overlap there? So for the diocese, when I refer to option 1 here, I'm kind of going back to these possibilities, requiring total elimination of debt or establishing a limit or restricting the amount versus entering into a custom arrangement. So it would make sense to say, hey, it'd be nice if the diocese, accepted only candidates who had entirely eliminated their debt before entering the theologate. And then we wouldn't even, have this issue, right? But then the reality of the situation is that there is a priest shortage, and this drastically would reduce the pool of candidates because it's more the norm that, people do have outstanding undergraduate educational debt rather than the exception. And just as a recommendation, I would say that it is important, however, that the conditions coming from the diocese be, that they be very transparent, that the diocese abides by them, that it doesn't, kind of change the terms over time, and that the commitment is made up front. Now, from the standpoint of the seminarian, is outstanding debt, an entry barrier, as was explored in those earlier studies that I referred to in the literature review? I would say not so much, because again, we saw here that 90% of the diocese are willing to accept men with outstanding educational debt. But that could be changing, as there was mention here and there of various dioceses exploring other options. And a lot of those options, actually, I'm grateful to say, had to do with having them work with charitable organizations like the Liabilities Society, in order to, find ways of minimizing or eliminating their debt. Now, what about this notion of debt being an exit barrier if one leaves the theologate or eventually leaves the priesthood? I think this is a minimal problem because, again, there's essentially no additional debt from theologate. One might be subject to partial repayment. So I did mention that there was, like half of expenses during their time there were $2,500 per semester. So that is true for sure. And then if there's any excess debt that one is carried into theologate beyond what would be covered by the diocese, then certainly, that's a liability as well to consider. And then generally, I would say, the seminarians would be better off if, from a financial standpoint, that's purely what I'm talking about here, if they were at least ordained, because there were those cases where the diocese would, upon ordination, immediately pay off either $30,000 or $50,000 worth of their debts. Or if they were to stay in ministry for at least 5 years, forgive all of their obligations. So in terms of limitations of the data, I did contact vocations directors, and sometimes their staff responded, and they might have different levels of knowledge or experience regarding the diocese financial policies. And I did attend, not this year, but the previous year, the NCDVD, the National Convention for Diocesan Vocation Directors, and got the sense that there is a high turnover rate with vocation directors, and many of them are newer and younger that come into the positions, and so they might not be as well versed, in what these financial policies are, and that's a consideration. And then just purely comprehension of the questions in my survey regarding the financial expectations upon leaving. Like I said, it might have been the case that some of the respondents focused more so on total outstanding debt versus solely debt incurred at the theologate level. And I kind of had to weed that out a little bit as best I could. And then with regard to the double submissions, there were 3 dioceses that submitted 2 questionnaires each, and the responses were mostly equivalent. It was only in one case that there was a discrepancy, and the way I handled that was as follows. The vocation director was talking about how debt was deferred while in formation, but then there was an 80-20 split after ordination where the diocese covers 80% of the priest's debt at that point. And that would depend on the amount of debt and the tax burden, whereas a staff member who responded from that diocese said that the remainder of the seminarian's debt would be paid off after ordination. So in that particular case, I deferred to the vocation director because it sounded like, the terms that individual was sharing was much more explicit. And obviously it didn't align with, hey, we just cover everything. There was some kind of limitation there. In terms of future research, just rounding things out here, I would love to follow up with interviews of vocation directors because, like I said, I used a basic questionnaire or survey. This would allow me to get further clarification on some of these lingering issues in terms of more specifics on the types of expenses covered, their time in position, what is their experience level and knowledge regarding these policies. I'd also love to be able to share feedback on current policies across dioceses since they can be, quite varied in some instances, and to identify best practices. And then when it comes to seminarians, it would also be nice to gain their added perspective on the handling of debt at the theologate level. So I would love it if anyone, if you're not able to ask questions at this time, or you would like to discuss further in future, please feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to contact me. This is my email here. Otherwise, I'm ready to take any questions that you all may have.
Well, we do have a couple, Kristina, so thank you so much for that thought-provoking summary of what you found so far. So one question that was just in kind of a methodological standpoint. So you chose the 35 dioceses that have theologates, as opposed to the 195 dioceses that are out there, right?
Yes.
So that's one of the limitations. Is we got, I guess, 21 dioceses responded. Is that what you said?
Yes. 21 dioceses, 24 respondents, but from 21 dioceses in the end. So it would be nice to have a larger array of dioceses, and that's an extension that I'm considering, of this research for sure. So thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, that is something that is foremost in my mind for sure.
Yeah, and thanks to Michael McGee from the Diocese of Richmond for catching that one in there, and just so I think again, if we're looking at the data, it is 21 dioceses, and so it's representative of those. Other dioceses may have different policies. A second question, also, we'll pass it on from Michael, is for the dioceses that expect partial repayment, did they indicate any adverse consequences of that practice, Kristina? Did you hear anything when you were talking to them?
Interesting. Yeah. So if they expect partial repayment and then the seminarian or the individual who left or was asked to leave for whatever reason was not able to pay, I didn't hear about any adverse consequences. In some cases, the way it was phrased was, we would like them to pay this back, if possible, so I suspect it doesn't happen in all cases that they're able to pay back what the diocese is expecting of them. And that would be worth looking into as well. Thank you.
I remember when you presented this earlier this year, that was one of the one of the comments was like, if a guy gets kicked out, and then they go and try and collect the lost tuition from him, well, like, good luck.
Yeah, exactly.
Have to have some good collections folks to make that happen. So another one, so Jay Atherton asked the question, what are those circumstances that would preclude a man's debt not to be deferred while they were in formation or the seminary? Do you have any idea on that, Kristina?
What would preclude their debt from not being deferred? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I wish I knew the answer to that question. I don't.
But I know we have several diocesan CFOs and other folks on here, as well as some seminary and theology professors here. So if anyone else, and there's a small enough group here, we can kind of open it up. Anyone else know the answer to that one?
Yeah, because I did mention that they would ask if possible for them to defer the payments, right? And I guess it depends on the type of loans that they might have coming from their undergraduate education.
Yeah, I could see that. And whether they're subsidized or unsubsidized, that might have some
Mhm.
implication on whether they choose to
Sure.
defer them or not.
That would be my guess, but if anyone has any further input on that, that would be great. Something else for me to look into as well.
There are some cases where the formation director is not too very sure if the guy's going to stick around, just putting it out there. And
What would
then-
that lead them to do, Brian, one way or another?
that would mean that there would be that there would be a circumstance would not be deferred because let's wait and see.
Yeah.
There are different
Well,
stages of seminary study, and let's wait until you get past this next stage.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing too, that I guess, and many of you on this are probably aware of this.
I'm sorry to interrupt again, but there's also independent wealthy. So there are some folks who also have assets, and then it also becomes an issue. I'll stop there. Sorry to interrupt.
No. Well, we're at the conversation point of the of the presentation now, Brian. So very grateful. For those who don't know, it's Dr. Brian Fraley, who's a member of our advisory council, actually one of our founding members of our advisory council, and also obviously an expert in this field and leading a theologian that's out there. So thanks, Brian. It is interesting too, and I just did a quick Google on it, but I think and there might be more current stats, the ones that I saw, that only 1/3 of men who enter college seminary, so the study was on theology, but only 1/3 of men who enter college seminary end up being ordained. And so there's a significant number of people, I don't know what the stats are for theology, but it's not the majority that go through. So this insight, I think, Kristina, on what happens when men leave is really interesting. And then, Kristina, another question that came up was, did you have any sense from these dioceses, did they feel that men stayed longer so they did not have to pay the debt? And so was the economic consequences of leaving a deterrent to leaving?
Oh, so were they actually considering this? And that was one of the main things on my mind when I started this research as well, as far as the whole notion of it being an exit barrier. And would that stop them from wanting to possibly enter in the first place, right? I've not received any comments from anyone that could give me further insight into this, other than when I was doing research for my previous study, those informal conversations among the MDiv students in seminary. I think it was only when we were having those conversations that they began to think about it. So maybe I spurred some of that thinking, and I don't know if that's good or bad, but yeah, it didn't seem like they were very aware of the consequences. They were more focused on, their call to priesthood and following that path, and not so much the financial considerations or possible obligations down the road.
Which I think is encouraging and good to hear. That's
Yeah.
what I hope their heads and hearts are for that kind of life decision. Yeah. And Kristina, just one other more informational pieces, but for the studies that you referenced Mary Gaudier's study and also the Miller and Ruger. That was Sharon Miller, right?
Yes, Sharon Miller.
So for those who are not aware, but both Mary Gaudier and Sharon Miller serve as research advisors for us through this fellowship program. And so it's nice to kind of get that intergenerational, which was part of what Chuck and Dr. John Wimmer, Dr. Zeck and Dr. Wimmer envisioned. So good to see you building on those. Are there any other questions? So people can pop a question if we didn't answer them in the chat room, or if you want to, again, we're small enough here, we can be a little more informal, and you can feel free to unmute yourself whether you have a question or any comments or insights off of what Kristina presented for us here today.
And I would certainly love to know if this resonates with anyone, how surprising was any of this, or was this sort of what you would have expected for those of you with experience in this area?
Thank you so much, Kristina, for your wonderful presentation. I think it's mind-blowing and quite revealing. Some of the causes for the shortage of priests. I think Christ is calling a lot of young men to the priesthood. And it just shows there's still a lot of work to be done on the managerial side of things to see how these other problems about the burden of their student loans can be relieved, so that a lot of people who have that interest but will have joined the priesthood or go to the seminary, but because of these other outstanding issues, won't have that barrier. So I think your presentation was really helpful in shedding that light. And I think I hope vocations directors will take a look at it and learn a couple of things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Augustine. It's really good to see you. Yes, I hope in future that I can again participate in one of the NCDVD conferences and share more information, because again, I would like to expand this to include more dioceses as well.
All right, well, if there's no additional questions, then again, thank you so much, Dr. Kristina Terkun, for continuing to do this work, even as you shift some of your other focus to the world of oncology, which we're also very grateful for, since that's a disease that impacts almost everyone. But we're grateful that you're continuing to also play in the world of the economics of religion, and particularly grateful that you continue to partner with the Villanova Center for Church Management. And so, Matt, I'm going to throw it back to you for kind of the final comments, then you can stop recording and we'll let everyone go a few minutes early today.
Great. Thanks again to Kristina. I'm a former seminarian, Kristina, and it was a topic I definitely found interesting based on my experiences. That a reminder that the recordings and slides of the presentation we put on the Center for Church Management website if you want to share this with someone else or go back and look at those slides. Another reminder that next week we want to welcome you back at Friday at 2 p.m. for our final webinar in our 3-part series. Our presenter will be Grace Pomeroy, who will be giving a presentation on funding forward, a pathway to more sustainable models for ministry. I'm going to stop the recording now. Kristina's agreed to stay on for a minute or two extra if anybody wants to talk to her more, and we wish you a blessed day.
Thank you
So much for joining.